3:17 a.m. The Philippine Sea, 16 degrees north latitude, 138 degrees east longitude. Depth, 5,800 meters. The planned submarine designated by U.S. Naval Intelligence as Special Mission Vessel Haiyang 3 had been at this position for 41 hours. It was not a fast attack submarine. It was not a ballistic missile boat. It was a specialized deep ocean research vessel that had been commissioned in 2021 with a public mission of seabed geological survey and a classified mission that the Office of Naval Intelligence had assessed with 74% confidence as cable interdiction. The vessel carried 2 autonomous deep-submergence vehicles, remotely operated systems capable of operating at depths up to 8,000 meters, each equipped with hydraulic cutting tools and a sensor package for locating and characterizing buried undersea cables. The cable running beneath this position was the Southeast Asia-Japan Pacific 3 link, one of 12 fiber optic cables that connected the Asia-Pacific region to the North American communications network. Its capacity, 96 terabits per second. Its traffic, approximately 31% of the data that moved between the U.S. military's Pacific Theater assets and the continental United States on any given day. Military traffic, commercial traffic, diplomatic traffic, all of it encrypted. All of it traveling in light pulses through 8 fiber strands suspended in a cable approximately 17 millimeters in diameter, buried 1.2 meters beneath the Philippine sea floor. The cable was not a military asset. It was a commercial asset operated by a consortium of telecommunications companies. Its protection was not an explicit military responsibility under any existing U.S. defense doctrine. Its disruption was not covered by any existing rules of engagement as an act of war requiring military response. That ambiguity was the third advantage of the cable interdiction approach. The first was the absence of any kinetic signature. No launch plume, no radar return, no acoustic weapon firing. The second was the absence of any SBIRS detection event. The third was the legal and political space between cutting a commercial cable and committing an act that authorized a military response. The plan had studied that space for 7 years before building the Haiyang series. At 3:17 a.m., the first deep submergence vehicle was released from Haiyang 3. It descended at 1.2 meters per second toward the seabed, 5,800 meters below. The descent would take approximately 80 minutes. At the same moment, 1,400 kilometers to the northeast, a second Haiyang vessel released its DSV above the Trans-Pacific Express cable running between California and Japan, a 120 terabit per second link carrying the highest bandwidth military data circuits in the Pacific. And 2,100 kilometers to the east, a third vessel was releasing its DSV above the Pacific Light Cable between California, Guam, and the Philippines. The cable whose cutting would specifically sever the backup communication path for Guam's military facilities, already degraded from the previous engagement. 3 vessels, 3 DSVs, 3 cables, coordinated simultaneous operations at 3:17 a.m. The U.S. Navy had been tracking all 3 Haiyang vessels for 19 days. The tracking had generated a Category 2 monitoring assessment, not assessed as posing an imminent military threat, classified as warranting continued surveillance. The assessment had been reviewed 6 times in 19 days and had been maintained at Category 2 on each review, primarily because the legal framework for responding to vessels that had not yet done anything, that were conducting what appeared to be legitimate research operations in international waters, did not support escalation to a higher alert category without evidence of hostile intent. The evidence of hostile intent had been there in the positioning data for 11 days. The 3 vessels had been moving to positions that, when mapped against the cable routing database, corresponded exactly to the locations of the Pacific Theater's 3 highest bandwidth military communications links. 3 vessels, 3 highest value cables, moving to position over 18 days. The positioning was not ambiguous to anyone who had the cable routing database, and the vessel tracking data in the same room. The cable routing database was classified secret. The vessel tracking data was maintained by a different directorate at a different classification level. The analyst who had both pieces of data in the same room had identified the overlap at day 11 and had submitted an assessment. The assessment had been received by a coordination cell that required review by 3 directorates before it could generate a response recommendation. The review was in progress when the DSVs were released. 3:17 a.m. Commander, Submarine Forces Pacific, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The Submarine Operations Watch had been tracking the 3 Haiyang vessels through the Pacific Submarine Forces passive hydroacoustic monitoring network. The sound surveillance system's remaining Pacific nodes, combined with the newer fixed distributed system sensors deployed across the western Pacific Basin. The Haiyang vessels' acoustic signatures had been catalogued. Their deep submergence vehicle operations were detectable, not through any weapon signature, but through the characteristic acoustic profile of a deep ocean vehicle's thruster system operating at depth. The first DSV release event was detected at 3:19 a.m. 2 minutes after the release, the hydroacoustic sensor array northeast of Guam returned a signal consistent with a vehicle thruster system descending from a Haiyang vessel's position. The watch officer had been tracking Haiyang vessel activities for 19 days and had the Category 2 monitoring assessment in his current watch package. When the DSV release signature appeared at 3:19 a.m., he had the cable routing database open on his secondary screen. He had requested access to it 6 days earlier, after the positioning analysis had suggested the vessels might be approaching cable-relevant positions. He identified the correlation in 47 seconds. At 3:20 a.m., he transmitted an urgent assessment to Pacific Fleet Command. 3 Haiyang vessels, probable DSV release. Cable interdiction posture assessment upgraded to high probability active operation. Pacific Fleet Command received the transmission at 3:21 a.m. The response authority for a probable cable interdiction operation, not a confirmed cable cut, not a weapons employment, not a kinetic act, did not sit with Pacific Fleet. It sat in a coordination chain that ran through the Joint Chiefs, the NSC's Crisis Management Directorate, and the legal review process that governed response to actions in international waters that had not yet produced a confirmed hostile act. The DSVs were descending. They were not yet at the seabed. The cables had not yet been cut. The legal space was still open. Pacific Fleet transmitted the assessment up the chain at 3:22 a.m. and simultaneously directed 2 actions within its existing authority. USS Connecticut, a Seawolf-class fast-attack submarine operating 340 kilometers south of the first Haiyang vessel's position, was ordered to close on the vessel at maximum safe speed. USS Illinois, a Virginia-class SSN operating in the Central Pacific, was ordered to close on the second vessel. USS North Dakota was directed toward the third. Maximum safe speed for a nuclear-powered fast-attack submarine is classified. The distance that needed to be closed varied between 340 and 890 kilometers across the 3 contacts. At the DSV descent rate of 1.2 meters per second, the cutting operation would reach the seabed in approximately 80 minutes. USS Connecticut needed 47 minutes to close to within effective range of the first Haiyang vessel. 47 minutes versus 80 minutes. Mathematics that worked, barely. The problem was that the authorization to do anything when USS Connecticut arrived had not yet been granted. At 3:28 a.m., the U.S. Navy's Cable Protection Authority, a function that existed in the legal framework covering U.S.-flagged vessels and cables in international waters, but that had never been operationalized in the form of a specific military response protocol, was being reviewed by 2 JAG officers at Pacific Fleet and simultaneously by the NSC's legal counsel, who had been called at 3:24 a.m. The question was not whether cable cutting was a hostile act. It clearly was, in any reasonable interpretation. The question was whether an act that had not yet been completed, conducted by a vessel that had not yet done anything that crossed a legal threshold for use of force, could be interdicted by a U.S. Navy submarine, using means that themselves constituted use of force? The answer to that question had several components. The short answer was yes, under certain conditions. The conditions required a determination that the act being prepared was of sufficient strategic significance to the United States to justify preemptive interdiction under the laws of armed conflicts self-defense principles. The determination required sign-off from the NSC principles. 3 of the 4 principles were reachable at 3:28 a.m. The 4th was unreachable for 11 minutes. The DSVs continued descending. At 3:44 a.m., 27 minutes after the DSVs were released, the first DSV reached the seabed at 5,800 meters depth. Its navigation system, using acoustic ranging from the vessel above and correlation against the preloaded cable survey data, maneuvered toward the cable's buried position. The cable's burial depth was 1.2 meters. The DSV's excavation capability used water jets to clear the burial sediment before the cutting tool was engaged. Excavation time required to expose the cable for cutting, estimated 8 to 12 minutes. At 3:47 a.m., the NSC authorization was received at Pacific Fleet. The authorization covered interdiction of the Haiyang vessel's DSV operations using non-kinetic means, specifically acoustic deterrence, physical interposition by U.S. submarine between the DSV and the cable, and if necessary, mechanical interference with the DSV's operation. The authorization did not cover weapons employment against the Haiyang vessels themselves. It did not cover disabling or sinking the surface vessels. The DSVs were fair game. The surface vessels were not. Non-kinetic acoustic deterrence, physical interposition, mechanical interference against a remotely operated vehicle at 5,800 meters depth. USS Connecticut had closed to within 40 kilometers of the first Haiyang vessel's position when the authorization was received. It was not within range of the DSV at 5,800 meters. Its own Mk-48 torpedoes could reach that depth, but a torpedo was a kinetic weapon and was not covered by the non-kinetic authorization. Its own ROV capability was limited to depths of 600 meters. The authorization's practical meaning at the capability available. USS Connecticut could position itself directly beneath the Haiyang vessel and activate its active sonar at full power. An active sonar at full power at close range to a cable-cutting operation would saturate the DSV's acoustic navigation system, potentially disorienting the navigation correlation between the DSV and the cable's buried position. Whether it would work was unknown. The DSV had not been designed to operate in close proximity to an active sonar field. Whether the navigation disruption would be sufficient, and whether the DSV's operators aboard Haiyang would simply wait for the interference to stop, was a question the authorization did not resolve. At 3:49 a.m., with the first DSV's excavation already in progress, USS Connecticut activated its active sonar at full power directly beneath the Haiyang vessel's position. The acoustic field reached the DSV at a range of approximately 5,700 meters below Connecticut's position. At that range, the active sonar's sound pressure level was sufficient to interfere with the acoustic ranging transponders that the DSV used to correlate its position to the cable survey grid. The DSV's navigation system began reporting position uncertainty. The excavation operation slowed as the operators aboard Haiyang attempted to re-establish accurate position correlation. 3 minutes. The excavation had slowed, but not stopped. The acoustic navigation was degraded, but the operators were working around it. The cable had not yet been cut. At 3:52 a.m., the first Haiyang vessel's commanding officer made a decision. He had been in contact with the plan's operational command since 3:20 a.m., when the U.S. submarine's acoustic signature had appeared in the waters below his vessel. He had known the USS Connecticut was coming. His operational briefing had included a probability assessment that U.S. submarines would attempt to close on his position. His protocol for that contingency was to continue the operation if the U.S. response remained non-kinetic, and to withdraw if kinetic threat was presented. Active sonar was non-kinetic. He continued. At 3:54 a.m., the DSV's excavation tool cleared the final sediment layer above the cable. The cable was exposed. The cutting tool was in position at 3:56 a.m. At 3:57 a.m., USS Connecticut's commanding officer received an updated authorization. The NSC principals, observing in real time through the intelligence feed that USS Connecticut had failed to stop the excavation operation with acoustic deterrence, had transmitted a second authorization: mechanical interference with the DSV. Specifically, the commanding officer was authorized to maneuver USS Connecticut to close physical proximity with the Haiyang vessel and use the submarine's own propeller wash and hull manipulation capability to disrupt the tether cable connecting the DSV to the surface vessel. The tether cable was the DSV's data link and power supply. It descended 5,800 meters from the vessel to the DSV. At the surface, it was a cable emerging from a winch system on the vessel's stern. At the midpoint of its 5,800-meter length, it was a cable suspended in the water column. USS Connecticut could not reach the midpoint of that cable in time. The midpoint was 2,900 meters below the surface. The submarine's operating depth was insufficient. What it could reach was the portion of the tether cable that emerged from the surface vessel's stern, the point where the cable fed over the winch and into the water. If USS Connecticut surfaced directly astern of the Haiyang vessel and used its control surfaces to create sufficient turbulence in the water around the vessel's stern, the commanding officer assessed the option in 44 seconds. It required surfacing in international waters within 200 meters of a Chinese research vessel, creating deliberate physical turbulence in the tether cable feed zone, and hoping that the physical interference would either snap the tether or cause the winch system to jam. None of this was certain. All of it was visible. A U.S. nuclear submarine surfacing next to a Chinese vessel in the Philippine Sea at 3:57 a.m. would be observed by the vessel's crew, potentially by any overhead collection that happened to be passing, and would represent the most visible demonstration of U.S. intent in the situation that had yet been produced. The second Haiyang vessel's DSV had also reached the seabed and was excavating. USS Illinois was still 190 kilometers away. The third vessel's DSV would reach its cable position in approximately 14 minutes. At 3:58 a.m., the first cable was cut. The SEA-JP3 link between Asia and North America went dark. The 31% of Pacific Theater military data traffic that had been flowing through that cable was rerouted automatically to backup paths by the network management systems of the commercial carriers operating the cable. The rerouting was automatic and took approximately 40 seconds. During those 40 seconds, the military traffic was queued. After 40 seconds, the traffic was flowing again through backup paths with reduced capacity. Reduced capacity. The primary link had carried 96 terabits per second. The backup capacity across all available alternative paths for the same traffic was approximately 58 terabits per second. Military communications in the Pacific Theater were now operating at approximately 60% of normal bandwidth, not zero, 60%. The authorization chain at the NSC principals had produced a third authorization at 3:59 a.m., the one that had been requested at 3:22 a.m., and that the legal review had finally completed. The authority to interdict the surface vessels using non-lethal physical means, including positioning a U.S. Navy surface vessel between the Haiyang vessels and their DSV operations to prevent further cable-cutting operations from being completed. USS Dewey, an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer operating 410 kilometers east of the second Haiyang vessel's position, was ordered at 3:59 a.m. to proceed at maximum speed to interpose between the vessel and its cable-cutting operation. Maximum speed for an Arleigh Burke, 30 knots. Distance to close, 410 kilometers. Time required, approximately 8 hours. 8 hours. Both remaining cables would be cut long before USS Dewey arrived. The Trans-Pacific Express cable was cut at 4:22 a.m., while the second DSV's excavation was still working through the sediment at its cut point. USS Illinois was still 120 kilometers away and would arrive in approximately 40 minutes, 18 minutes after the cut. Pacific military communications bandwidth was now at approximately 38% of normal capacity across the theater. The Pacific Light cable cut occurred at 4:47 a.m. USS North Dakota arrived at the 3rd Haiyang vessel's position at 4:52 a.m., 5 minutes after the cut. Its commanding officer had the authorization for acoustic deterrence and tether interference, but had arrived too late for either to be operationally relevant. Pacific military communications bandwidth, approximately 19% of normal capacity. 3 cables, 3 cuts, 3 hours and 30 minutes. No weapon had been fired in any direction. No vessel had been threatened. No life had been endangered. The Haiyang vessels had conducted what was, in the legal framework that the NSC had been navigating for 3 hours and 30 minutes, a hostile act of enormous strategic consequence, and had done so in the space between the existing rules of armed conflict and the existing response authorities that covered military action in international waters. The immediate military effect of 19% bandwidth. Every data-dependent system in the Pacific Theater was operating on degraded communications. The encrypted military traffic that normally moved through the commercial cable infrastructure was now competing for bandwidth on the remaining backup paths. The military satellite communications network, the remaining undersea cable segments that had not been cut, and the HF radio fallback that represented the theater's last communications layer. The carrier strike groups in the Philippine Sea were operating at reduced data throughput. Their CEC networks were functional, but slower. Their logistics coordination systems were queued. The drone surveillance networks that provided the theater's continuous situational awareness were reporting imagery at reduced update rates. Nothing had stopped working. Everything had slowed. At 4:58 a.m., the commander of Pacific Fleet transmitted his assessment to the Joint Chiefs. The theater was in a degraded communications state that reduced its effective response capability to approximately 31% of optimal for the next estimated 7 to 14 days, which was the repair timeline for the 3 cable cuts using the available cable repair vessels. 7 to 14 days. The cable repair ship closest to the first cut site was the CS Reliance, a cable repair vessel based in Guam. Its transit time to the SEAJP-3 cut position was approximately 4 days. The repair itself required an additional 2 to 4 days, depending on sea conditions. The Trans-Pacific Express cut was deeper and further from the nearest repair vessel, estimated 10 to 14 days. 7 to 14 days at 19% bandwidth capacity. The plan had not fired a missile. It had not launched an aircraft. It had not activated an ASAT system. It had released 3 deep-submergence vehicles from research vessels in international waters and had spent 3.5 hours cutting cables at 5,800 meters depth. The response had been acoustic deterrence and 3 U.S. submarines that had arrived too late, moving through a legal and political framework that had not been designed for the speed at which the operation had been executed. 7:14 a.m. Commander, Pacific Fleet. Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The Pacific Fleet commander had been at his headquarters since 3:24 a.m., when the initial watch officer's assessment had reached his duty officer. He had been the senior U.S. military officer in the Pacific Theater, watching 3 commercial cables get cut while the legal review process worked through its required steps. He was not frustrated with the legal process. The legal process existed for good reasons and had been navigated under genuine time pressure by people working at the limit of their authorization authority. The process had produced 3 authorizations. The authorizations had been insufficient to stop the cuts because the capabilities available to execute them had not been positioned within the response timeline required. The capability timeline mismatch was what he needed to close. He had submitted a positioning request for continuous forward-deployed cable protection patrols, specifically a Virginia-class submarine within 2 hours maximum speed transit of each of the 12 major Pacific cable crossing points. At 5:41 a.m., the request was classified. Its cost estimate was approximately $840 million annually in additional submarine operating hours. Its authorization requirement ran through the CNO and the SecDef. It had been submitted. Its review was pending. The second recommendation he submitted at 6:02 a.m. was a cable protection legal framework, a pre-authorized response protocol that established specific triggers for U.S. Navy interdiction of vessels observed conducting probable cable-cutting operations, with the authorization pre-granted rather than requiring real-time NSC review. The framework would reduce the response authorization time from the approximately 30 to 47 minutes experienced in this engagement to an estimated 4 to 6 minutes. Both recommendations had been submitted before the sun had risen over Pearl Harbor. Time from first DSV release to first cable cut, 41 minutes. Time from first cable cut to last cable cut, 49 minutes. Time from first DSV detection to USN arrival at first position, 38 minutes. Too late by 9 minutes. Time from first DSV detection to NSC authorization for physical interdiction, 41 minutes. Received 1 minute after first cut. Pacific Theater, military communications, bandwidth, post-engagement, 19% of normal. Estimated restoration timeline, 7 to 14 days via cable repair vessels. Plan assets employed, 3 Haiyang-class special mission vessels, 6 deep-submergence vehicles, 2 per vessel, 3 cable-cutting operations, 0 kinetic weapons employed, 0 SBIRS detectable events, 0 radar cross-section events, 0 acoustic weapon signatures, U.S. military assets employed, USS Connecticut, USS Illinois, USS North Dakota, acoustic deterrence only, arrived post-cut for 2 of 3 cuts. No weapons fired. No physical interdiction achieved. Countermeasures pending authorization. USS Dewey, en route to second cut position. ETA 8 hours post-cut. Additional cable protection submarine positioning requests submitted to CNO. The Haiyang vessels had departed their positions and were proceeding on northwest headings. They were in international waters. No legal authority existed to interdict their departure. They would reach Chinese territorial waters in approximately 36 hours. The legal review of whether the cable-cutting operation constituted an act of war under international law and whether a military response after the fact was authorized was ongoing. The preliminary assessment from the NSC's legal counsel was that it did constitute an act of war under any reasonable interpretation. The question of what military response was proportionate and legally authorized against vessels that had completed their mission and were withdrawing was more complex. The answer to that question was above the Pacific Fleet Commander's authority to determine. He had submitted his capability timeline recommendations. He had flagged the legal framework gap. He had identified the submarine positioning requirement. He had the 19% bandwidth number on his screen. 7 to 14 days. The sun was coming up over Pearl Harbor. The Pacific was quiet. The cables were cut. The most consequential military operation conducted against the United States in this engagement series had employed no weapons, generated no launch signatures, and had been executed by vessels whose mission designation was scientific research. The silence at 2:41 a.m. in the Baltic scenario had taken 22 minutes to produce its effect. The silence at 3:17 a.m. in the Philippine Sea had taken 41 minutes to cut 3 cables and had needed 3.5 years of assessment gap to make it possible. 3.5 years, 19 days of tracking, 11 days of overlap data, 6 review cycles that maintained Category 2. The cables had been cut in the space that those numbers described.